My name is Olivia. I'm 35 years old, and I always thought my life was close to perfect. I had a loving husband, John, and we had been together for over 10 years. We built our home from the ground up, worked on our careers, traveled, and supported each other through everything. From the outside, our life looked like a fairy tale. But over time, I started to feel like something was missing. John was attentive, but lately, his care felt more like a routine than genuine affection. I noticed how he stayed late at work, how our conversations became brief and predictable. When we went out to dinner, he spent most of the time looking at his phone. I didn't complain, but deep down, I began to feel lonely. One day, my company organized a corporate party at a fancy restaurant. It was a big event with music, champagne, and dancing. John couldn't come because of urgent work, so I decided to go alone. Honestly, I thought the evening would be boring, and I planned to leave early. I was standing by the bar, sipping my cocktail, when my colleague, Nick, approached me. We weren't close. We had only exchanged a few words at work before. But tonight, he seemed different, confident, charming, and a little mysterious. "Do you always look this bored at parties?" he asked with an easy smile. I laughed. "Maybe I'm just not good at this whole socializing thing." "Let's fix that," he said, handing me a glass of champagne. We ended up talking for nearly an hour, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly listened to. His jokes, attentiveness, and effortless conversation made me forget about everything else. When he suggested stepping out onto the terrace for some fresh air, I agreed without hesitation. The terrace was cool, and Nick took off his jacket and draped it over my shoulders. It was a simple gesture, but it made me catch my breath. We stood side by side, looking out over the city, and the silence between us suddenly felt charged. "Olivia, you're incredible," he said, turning to look directly at me. "How does someone not see that?" His words caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond. Was he just being polite? Or was there something more? But when he leaned in closer, I didn't pull away. His lips softly brushed against mine, and I felt my knees weaken. It was brief, but it was enough to set off a storm of emotions inside me. "I need to go," I said, stepping back, even though every part of me wanted to stay. Nick didn't stop me, but his gaze lingered as I hurried away, leaving him on the terrace. The drive home was a blur, my mind replaying what had just happened over and over. The morning after that night was heavier than I could have imagined. As I woke up, the memory of Nick's words and the kiss on the terrace played on repeat in my mind. I told myself it was just a reckless moment, something that would never happen again. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of his smile, his voice, and the way he made me feel. When I arrived at work, my heart raced faster than usual. I buried myself in tasks, hoping to avoid Nick, hiding behind my computer screen and a pile of documents. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before our paths crossed. During lunch, I decided to go to the cafeteria later than usual, hoping to miss the crowd. But as soon as I entered, I saw Nick sitting at a table by the window. He noticed me immediately and waved with that effortless charm of his. "Olivia, don't hide, come join me," he called out with a smile. I hesitated, but eventually sat across from him. "How are you?" he asked, his gaze fixed on me.
"Fine."
"Just a lot of work," I replied, avoiding his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about work too, and a little about other things," he said, that same smile playing on his lips. "Nick, that was just a moment." "We both know it didn't mean anything," I said quickly, trying to protect myself. "Maybe it was just a moment for you, but it wasn't for me," he said, leaning in slightly. "I can't stop thinking about you." My heart pounded. His words felt too real to ignore, but I knew I was walking a dangerous line. I forced myself to look away, and stood up. "Nick, we need to keep our distance," I said, trying to sound firm. He didn't argue, just nodded, but I could feel this wasn't the end. A few days later, I found a small bouquet on my desk. Just a handful of wildflowers tied neatly with a ribbon. There was no note, but I knew immediately who it was from. My heart started racing again. I glanced toward his office, and our eyes met. Nick smiled and lifted a folder as if to say he was busy. I couldn't help but smile back. There was something thrilling about these small gestures, about how he found ways to get through my defenses. That evening, when the office was nearly empty, I stayed late to finish a project. I didn't expect Nick to still be there, but as I walked past his office, I noticed the light was on. He was sitting at his desk, jotting something down. When he saw me, he got up and came into the hallway. "Late night for work?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Just trying to finish everything before the deadline," I replied, trying to keep my distance. "Sometimes work is just an excuse to stay," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Want some coffee?" I wanted to say no, but instead I nodded. We walked to the office kitchen, and as the coffee machine hummed, he stood close, closer than was appropriate. "Olivia, you know I won't stop. You're special to me, and I need you to know that," he said softly but firmly. Those words broke through my last line of defense. I looked at him, and my heart clenched. In that moment, I took the first risky step. I let him get closer. His lips met mine softly, and the world around us disappeared. The days after that night were strange. Every glance, every touch, every coincidental encounter with Nick in the office was filled with a tension that was impossible to ignore. We tried to act like regular colleagues, but anyone who looked at us could see there was something more. One day, Nick invited me to lunch. It seemed like a harmless invitation, no hidden intentions. But deep down, I knew that by agreeing, I was crossing a line once again. We chose a small cafe near the office. The atmosphere was cozy, but there was an undeniable intimacy in the air. Nick ordered coffee and pastries for both of us, and as we sat at a table by the window, he gave me his full attention as always. "Olivia, I don't want to be a problem for you," he said suddenly, his voice calm but serious. "You already are," I said with a bitter smile. "But it's not just you. It's me too." "It's not about blame," he said, leaning closer. "It's about what we want." "And what do you want?" I averted my gaze, trying to avoid his question. But he didn't let me escape. His hand gently touched mine, and I felt my heart pounding. "Nick, I can't do this," I whispered, even though deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. "Then why are you here?" he asked softly but firmly. We sat in silence, but that silence said more than any words could. That evening, when everyone else had left the office, Nick offered to drive me home. I wanted to decline, but for some reason I agreed. The car was quiet, with only soft music playing in the background. He didn't say much, but his presence, his gaze on the road, stirred something inside me. When we pulled up to my house, he turned off the engine and looked at me. "I can't stop, Olivia," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "I know this is wrong, but you feel it too, don't you?" I didn't know what to say. Everything inside me screamed that I should get out of the car and end this for good. But instead, I stayed silent. "Tell me you don't want this, and I'll walk away," he said softly, but with determination. I wanted to say it. I wanted to turn away, but the words didn't come. Instead, I looked at him and answered not with words, but with action. I leaned in and kissed him. We ended up at his apartment, though I couldn't even remember how we got there. Everything before this moment felt like an eternity, but the night passed in the blink of an eye. His touch was as passionate as his gaze, and every move felt like it carried the connection I had long lost with my husband. We didn't speak much. Words weren't necessary. But inside, I was torn between indescribable pleasure and unbearable guilt. When it was over, I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling. I knew this moment would change everything, and I wasn't ready for what was to come. The morning after that night was heavier than I could bear. When I woke up, Nick was still asleep, his face peaceful as if nothing had happened. But inside me, there was a storm raging. I quietly got dressed, trying not to wake him, and slipped out of the apartment. As I sat in the taxi, the driver's glances in the mirror felt judgmental, even though he had no idea where I was coming from or why. I clasped my hands tightly, fighting back tears, but the weight of what I had done felt suffocating. John was home when I got back. He was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and his laptop in front of him. "Home early?" he asked, not even looking up. "Just decided to start the day earlier," I replied, trying to sound casual. He nodded and turned his attention back to the screen. His indifference, which I used to accept as part of our routine, now cut deep. I thought I could continue living as if nothing had happened, but every gesture, every word reminded me of the betrayal I carried with me. The days after that night were tense. Nick acted as if nothing had changed, but I could see the anticipation in his eyes. He didn't say much, but his actions spoke louder. He left small notes on my desk, found excuses to stay late with me after work, and each time his presence became more dangerous. One evening, as the office was nearly empty, he walked into my office. "We can't keep doing this," he said, closing the door behind him. "Nick, it was a mistake," I replied, though there was no conviction in my voice. "It wasn't a mistake, Olivia. It was the most honest thing I've done in years," he said, his voice low but determined. I could feel him moving closer, and though I tried to keep my distance, my heart betrayed me with every beat. A few days later, I found myself in his apartment again. It wasn't planned, but neither of us seemed willing to stop. His touch, his voice, his confidence, they filled the void I had felt at home. But with each night we spent together, the weight of my guilt grew heavier. One evening, when I got home later than usual, John was sitting in the living room. His gaze was cold and piercing. "You look tired. Long day at work?" he asked, but there was something more behind the question than simple curiosity. "Yes, a lot of projects lately," I replied, avoiding eye contact. "Interesting," he said, standing up from his chair. "You've been working a lot recently. But it seems like you've changed." His words caught me off guard. Did he suspect something? My heart started pounding, but I tried to maintain composure. "John, you know it's just stress," I said quickly. He said nothing, just looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Let's hope it's just stress." A few days after John left, the tension in my chest was unbearable. Our house, which once felt warm and inviting, now felt like an empty shell. Guilt and shame weighed heavily on me, and no amount of tears could lift the burden. One evening, I decided to meet with Nick. I needed answers to understand if there had been any meaning to all of this. We met at a small cafe far from the office. He looked uneasy, a far cry from his usual confident self. "Nick, I've lost everything because of us. I need to know, was it worth it?" I asked, barely holding back tears. He looked at me with a pained expression, but it wasn't the look I wanted to see. It was the gaze of someone who had already made up his mind. "Olivia, I don't know what to say. What we had was real, but it was never going to last." His words shattered me. I realized I had not only lost John, but also the illusion I had created for myself. Nick was no longer the man I thought he was. He stood up, placed some money on the table, and quietly said, "Take care of yourself," and that was it. No goodbye, no final glance. Just emptiness. A few weeks later, I received a call from an unknown number. It was John's lawyer. He wanted to discuss the divorce. But to my surprise, John wasn't just filing for divorce. He was also leaving me the house. He wants you to start a new life, the lawyer said. But on one condition. He never wants to see you again. It felt like the final blow. Even in his rejection, John was more generous than I deserved. I decided not to sell the house. Instead, I stayed and made it my own. Rather than filling it with memories of the past, I began creating new ones. I threw myself into things I'd always put off, starting a small business, picking up painting, and reconnecting with people who truly cared about me. One day, while organizing some old boxes, I found our wedding photos. Instead of hiding them away, I decided to keep one on a shelf. It wasn't an attempt to hold on to the past, but a reminder of what I had lost because of my actions. I never saw John or Nick again, but I learned that the journey ahead wasn't about finding someone to fill the void. It was about learning to live with myself.
Please subscribe to our channel Stellar Stories. We have new amazing stories coming out every day. Thank you.